In this video, we'll be looking at homeostasis. Now, this chapter is actually a GCSE Biology only topic. So if you're doing combined sciences, then you don't need to know about homeostasis in this amount of detail. But you might remember that in the previous chapter about the hormones chapter, you would have already come across the concept of homeostasis, and also actually in the nervous system topic as well, because we say homeostasis is about maintaining our internal conditions, keeping them relatively stable through negative feedback. So this whole thing, this homeostasis, requires both the nervous system and the hormonal system working together to maintain all of these conditions inside the body. And we said that there are three main examples, which are the blood glucose level, which you have learned about in the hormonal system chapter already. But there are two more, which it would be your body temperature and the blood water levels. And those two examples will therefore be covered in this particular chapter and also in this video. But if you need a recap on what homeostasis is, then you might want to go back to and watch the other video that I made on the nervous system and the hormonal system. So key thing to remember about homeostasis is that the body does something called negative feedback to ensure that the body conditions are kept the same. So what we mean by that is, if I draw a graph, let's say this is the average level in our body, or let's say it's the average body temperature. When it gets too high, your body would react in a way to bring it back down. And when it gets too low, your body reacts in a way to bring it back up. So it's trying to reverse whatever stimulus it is experiencing. Hence the word negative feedback is trying to reverse that change. So we saw how insulin and glucagon would do that in blood glucose level, and now we're going to look at the body temperature and the control of water levels inside our blood. So we got two specific words for this, which are thermoregulation and osmoregulation. So we're going to start with thermoregulation. So again, we can look at the word, looking at specifically the prefixes to kind of decide what the word actually means. So let's start with the bit that says thermo. So thermal kind of refers to temperature, right? This refers to temperature. So thermoregulation is regulating of our body temperature. So the key thing about thermoregulation is the few things you need to know. Number one is, what is the organ that controls our body temperature, and what are some of the ways that our body reacts when it gets too hot or too cold. So first of all, the thermoregulation is controlled by the thermoregulatory center in our hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is a part of the brain which is heavily involved in homeostasis. So it's got lots of different parts to the hypothalamus. It can have a part that controls your heart rate, and the part we're going to look at is the thermoregulatory center that controls our body temperature. So keeping in mind that, let's say for human beings, our average body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius. So sometimes it can get a bit too hot. So let's say you've been running around and you've been exercising, doing respiration, which is exothermic reaction, so your body temperature goes a bit too high. Or it could be that you've had a fever because you had an infection, or therefore you want to bring your body temperature back down to avoid the enzymes denaturing. So how can the body do that? So there are three specific ways that they could make this work. The first thing we're going to look at is called vasodilation. Vaso referring to blood vessels, dilation meaning to dilate or to make bigger. So what happens is that some of the blood vessels going towards the surface of your skin would dilate, allowing more blood flow to the surface of your skin. So that's why you might see that someone has a flushed face or red skin when they're having a fever. It's because of vasodilation. And the benefit of that is that because there's more blood near the surface, therefore more heat can be lost through infrared radiation. Another obvious mechanism is sweating. So your sweat gland starts to produce more liquid, more sweat, and what happens is that the sweat would absorb your body heat and evaporate away. And that process actively takes body heat away from you, therefore cooling you down. A third thing that you can also say is the fact that the hairs on your skin would lie flat. Again, the idea is to reduce the amount of air trapped on the surface of your skin, and therefore allowing more heat to escape. So those are the three things that could happen in your body to cool yourself down. Now, the opposite obviously is if it gets a bit too cold, right? So it could be that it's in the winter time, or you're not wearing enough clothes, or whatever the reason might be, you're feeling very cold. And again, we need to warm the body up to make sure that the enzymes are working in the optimal temperature. So again, few things could happen. So pretty much the exact opposite to what we said in the hot section there. So one thing that you could talk about is the opposite to vasodilation, which is vasoconstriction. So constriction means to become smaller. So what we mean by that is that the lumen of the blood vessels would become smaller, limiting the amount of blood flow to the surface of your skin. And that would, again, reducing blood flow, therefore reduces the amount of heat loss through radiation. And opposite to hairs lying flat, then the hairs can stand straight or stand up. And the idea is that it can trap a layer of air on the surface of your skin, kind of acting like an insulating layer. So kind of imagine any puffer jackets that you might have. The reason why it's warm is because the cotton in the puffer jackets have trapped lots of air inside, acting as insulation. And another one is obviously shivering. So when you're very cold, you shiver. And the reason for that is shivering is actually uncontrolled muscle contractions. So when your body's too cold, the hypothalamus will send a signal to your muscles and tell them to start contracting. And contraction requires energy. Energy comes from respiration. So what's happening is that your muscle cells are forced to do more respiration, which is an exothermic reaction. And by doing more respiration, it gives out energy for your muscles to contract and shivering, but also releases heat, which is the key thing that we want out of shivering. Is through shivering, you actually generate that heat for your body. So thermoregulation is the control of our body temperature, keeping it around 37 degrees Celsius in human beings. And that is done mainly through the hypothalamus, specifically the thermoregulatory center. And you can see that there are a few actions that the body takes to make sure that you don't get too cold or too hot. So the other example of homeostasis is osmoregulation. So look at the word osmo, think of osmosis, right? So osmo refers to water, right? So osmoregulation is controlling how much water there is in the blood or in your body in general. Again, we're going to look at what is the main method for osmoregulation, but actually we need to look at specifically the organ that does osmoregulation and how it actually works to do two things. Number one is osmoregulation, and number two is to get rid of the waste products that we don't want. So first of all, the osmoregulation is actually mainly monitored and controlled by the pituitary gland. So again, the pituitary gland is a part of the brain, same as the hypothalamus. And in fact, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland are connected in the brain, and they both work together a lot of times to do homeostasis for the rest of the body. So sometimes the hypothalamus could detect those changes, like in thermoregulation, and then it can send either an electrical impulse through the nervous system to bring about those changes, or sometimes it can actually signal the pituitary gland to release hormones, again to bring about different changes. So the key thing is that the pituitary gland can release a hormone called ADH. So ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone, and this hormone specifically travels through the bloodstream to the kidneys, which does osmoregulation for us. So what you need to know in this topic as well is how does the kidney actually function? So it does a few major really important things. Number one, it actually filters the blood to get rid of all of the waste products that we don't want. And then it actually is able to reabsorb all the useful chemicals back into our bloodstream to make sure we don't lose them. And both of these steps lead to production of urine, which is your pee. As part of that, they can then do osmoregulation, which is about controlling how much water does the kidney want to retain, and any excess water will then be obviously turned into urine and be excreted out along with the waste products. So now we're going to have a look at the few steps that the kidneys take to produce urine. So step one is called ultrafiltration. So the key thing is to remove three things: urea, any excess water and salts. And salts would be like things like minerals, like sodium ions or chloride ions, etc. And the thing is, these are in the blood, and in this step, ultrafiltration, there's no real control in terms of what can come out except for the size of that chemical. So the chemicals like urea, water, and salts are small enough to leave the bloodstream into the kidneys, and therefore they can be moved into the kidneys. However, during this process, unfortunately, some of the nutrients that we have also escapes. So this would include things like glucose, amino acids, hormones, vitamins. All of those things can also leave the blood, which obviously we don't want that to happen, because the nutrients are useful for us. We want to retain them. So therefore, that leads us to the second step, selective reabsorption. So in this particular step, what they do is then they would choose the nutrients that they would reabsorb, and most of the time is pretty much as they would try to reabsorb as many nutrients as they possibly can. On top of that, they may also reabsorb some of the water and salt, because actually water and salt are useful chemicals in the body. We just can't have too much of them because it can cause lots of different issues in terms of water retention and osmosis. So in this particular part, this is where osmoregulation comes in. So in this case, what happens is mainly thinking about the amount of water that is being absorbed. If your body is dehydrated, then what happens is the body would release more ADH from the pituitary glands, and if the kidneys receive more ADH, then they would increase the amount of water reabsorbed into the body. And vice versa, if you actually had a lot to drink, then the pituitary gland would detect that and therefore release less ADH, therefore less water is therefore reabsorbed, so that you get more water being excreted from the body. So therefore, from this step, any excess that is remaining in the kidneys, so excess water, excess salt, and along with all the urea, becomes your urine. Now, because the kidneys does such an important function in terms of, controlling the amount of urine that is made and to absorb nutrients needed, therefore, if the kidneys are damaged or failed in whatever reason, it is important that we can treat the kidney failure. So the two methods are dialysis or a kidney transplant. So first of all, dialysis is a technique, is a way where the patient actually goes to a dialysis machine. And what happens during dialysis is that the blood of the patient actually leaves the patient through, obviously through the various tubes that they would connect to, and the blood actually goes into the dialysis machine, which functions as the kidney for the patient. So the blood leaves the patient, goes into the dialysis machine, which is then able to do ultrafiltration and also to make sure that there is enough nutrients being returned back into the blood before the blood actually returns back into the patient's body. Okay, so it's a basically for this one, it's something that has been used in many years now and is really well practiced. Therefore, it is very, very reliable. Right? It pretty much definitely works for any patient who needs a dialysis because of their kidney failure. However, there are some concerns at times. Because you are letting the blood leaving your body and going into a machine, there is a risk of infection if the whole process is not done correctly. The other concern is that it actually lowers the quality of life, because the dialysis process takes quite a long time. So it can take about 6 to 8 hours if needed. So they need to do this about 3 to 4 times maybe per week. So imagine a patient having to go to a dialysis center and be hooked onto a machine pretty much for the whole day. It can have a massive impact on what they are able to do in life because of the time it takes. Obviously, there are people who might be able to buy a dialysis machine to do it at home while they're sleeping. However, this is not something that is possible for lots of people because of the cost and obviously concerns about having medical people around to ensure that nothing goes wrong with the machine and the patient in terms of infection as well. The other option is to do a kidney transplant, right? So obviously for this one, it is pretty much a permanent cure, right? It is a permanent cure. So your kidney's not working, therefore you give the patient a new kidney. Therefore, the whole problem is done. But there are obviously a few issues. First of all is maybe there's not enough donors, so there are not enough kidneys around to actually even allow you to do the transplant. And then the major concern, as is with most organ transplants, is organ rejection. So this is when the patient's white blood cell will recognize the new organ as a foreign thing because of the foreign antigens, and therefore they might attack the organ and destroy a perfectly healthy kidneys, which is not what you want. Now, there is a way to fix that or to reduce the impact of that, which is to use immunosuppressant drugs. So as the name implies, it suppresses your immune system. So essentially, it's like dampening down the effects of the white blood cells to prevent them from attacking the new organ. But considering that obviously comes with its own sets of risk, which is you're dampening down your immune system, which means your immune system is now weakened. This means that the patient might be more prone to having a much more serious response to any kind of infection because the white blood cells are not allowed to react as they normally would. So for someone who has received an organ transplant, a kidney transplant, and they're taking immunosuppressant drugs, they will have to take extra care in terms of in terms of hygiene and in order to lower the risk or the chance of them getting infected. So these are the two ways to treat kidney failure, both with their pros and cons. And in terms of exam questions, what they might do is to give you some information about a particular kidney treatment. It could be a mixture of these two or perhaps a brand new treatment that you've not heard of before. And what they might ask you to do is to use the information provided and your own understanding, which is this one here, to evaluate the use of a particular treatment. So this is the summary of homeostasis. Make sure that you're aware of how the two examples of homeostasis can be done in the body, and looking at them as specific examples for as negative feedback, because some of the questions might ask you to suggest examples of this and explain these examples, and also looking at the kidney failure treatments and make sure you're able to evaluate these two different types of treatments.